textile sector, as you know, is very important, still important, contributing to the economy, but mushkilat hain. So I would say silver fiber is turning into ashes. So we should stop then before it completely turn into ash. So इसमें हमारे साथ we have very rich panel. First of all, the Gohar Ejaz Saab needs no introduction, but for the sake of introductions, he is Patron-in-Chief of APTMA. Salman Akram Raja Saab, advocate of Supreme Court and over 30 years of experience. Gonzalo J. Varela, senior economist at the World Bank. Ali Khizr Saab, he is the head of research at Business Recorder. Then we have the session will be moderated by Hamid Zaman Saab, he's the chairman of APTMA. And then Amir Fayaz Saab, he's the chief executive of the Kohinoor Mills. So the session is about the sustainable growth, that how textile center can contribute into it, and what are the constraints जो कि मुश्किलात हैं हुकूमत की तरफ से ओवरऑल जो बिजनेस एनवायरनमेंट है जो कि सबको फेस करना पड़ता है, बट पर्टिकुलरली टू द टेक्सटाइल सेक्टर because a major exporting sector है हमारा, so we can earn foreign exchange, we can get our economy stabilized अगर ये वाला sector stabilize हो जाता है. So discussion points जो होंगे, growth challenge होगा, the distortions in resource allocation, Pakistan productivity challenges, productivity related to trade, agriculture productivity, which is at the pivot of this industry कि जो हमारी agriculture productivity है, that is going down. Foreign direct investment नहीं हो पा रही है, उसके बारे में how we can close the gap, उसके बारे में बात होगी. Then we have vision 2033, 2050 जो हमारे जो panelists हैं, they will talk about that. Pakistan vulnerability regarding the climate change. हमारी already ही productivity is going downward. Now we have the climate change, the temperatures are going up. So how we will cope with this climate change issue? Then regionally competitive energy tariff जो कि बड़ा important होता है for the export sector के, और especially in textile sector because almost half of it is the energy जो कि आपकी input लगता है. So if that's a problem, then the whole textile sector is a problem. So our rich panel will talk about this. So I'll just hand over to Hamid Zaman Saab, the moderator. Sir, over to you.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. We have a very distinguished panel, all masters in their own field, and I will just give a brief introduction and then pass it over to the panelists for detailed discussions. What is the importance of textiles? 40 to 45% of our workforce is in textiles. 60% plus of all our export is from textiles. 8.5% is the share in the GDP for textiles. So textile is the biggest sector, industrial sector in the economy of Pakistan, and high textile growth means high growth in the economy. I'm just going to touch a little on the causes of low growth, sustainable growth. One of the biggest causes is political and governmental instability. Sustainable growth is linked to political instability, and a comprehensive structural framework which promotes industrialization and a growth in exports with long-term policies which create a conducive business environment. Weak governments become prey to vested interest groups and powerful cartels, which then manipulate conditions to obtain favors and subsidies which may not benefit the country in the long run. Decisions are then based on politics rather than the economy. These policies also create inefficiencies in our production. They lack continuity and consistency. So the state of governance and stability and certainty of the governments which complete their tenures is very basic to how the economy will grow. The inward-looking attitudes of our business people. Let's not just put the blame on on the government policies, there is also an issue. First of all, we are not an exporting economy, and so it causes inefficiencies because we are only competing against each other and not internationally against more efficient companies. And because of the subsidies or help we may get from the government from time to time, we become inefficient and unable to compete in the international market. And then we have a consumption-based model which we follow. The textile industry has been in a sort of a flux for the last year or so. We had 2-3 years of very high growth, and which was leading to industrialization. It was export-led growth, and for the first time in the history of Pakistan, our exports increased to over $31 billion with textiles up to $19.3 billion, retaining its position of 60%. This growth was achieved on the back or basis of inexpensive finances that we received from the government and the state bank, number one. Number two, very important, the regionally competitive energy tariffs that were given to us and which enabled us to compete with the rest of the world on an equal footing. And number three, the policies of the government which were totally geared towards the growth of exports. Unfortunately, over the last 6-8 months, there has been a bit of uncertainty and maybe a change in policies, and the energy tariffs are changing, and I think, and apart from that, there is a global recession. So textiles and industry in general is not doing as well as it should. However, and the inward-looking attitude of the business people, I just want to give an example. In the last 3 years, there was an investment of $5 billion, which is one of the biggest investments in the textile sector. And 40% was, and that was very inexpensive rates. It was on finance provided by the State Bank of Pakistan under the turf and LTFF facilities. And 40% went into spinning, 30% into weaving, 20% into knitting, 10% into processing. And there was no value addition. Now, these are some of those factors which will inhibit our growth. But the machinery was installed, the investment was done, and we are now in a position to expand our exports by a good 25-30% and take them to a much higher level over the next 5 years. Our commitment was to $50 billion. But given the turmoil in the last year and the change in policies, a lot of this machinery installed is now lying idle. However, that's the story of textiles. I will turn over the mic to Mr. Gonzalo Varela, who has written a book called From Swimming in Sand to High Growth and Sustainable Growth, High and Sustainable Growth, a roadmap to reduce distortions in the allocation of resources and talent in the Pakistan economy. Mr. Gonzalo, who's a Uruguayan, has spent almost 4 years in Pakistan, and he has done a lot of research and written this book, and is now towards the end of his term. So, Mr. Gonzalo, please.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. So the book that was mentioned is an activity that the World Bank, I am a senior economist for the World Bank, and that the World Bank undertakes in client countries approximately every 5 years. So it's basically a growth study. I invite you all to download it and read it. I hope you find it interesting. And when we started working on this, one of the facts that it was actually discussed in the initial session here on the boom and bust cycle of Pakistan is Pakistan's growth over the past 2 decades has been low, 1.7% real GDP per capita growth. Just to put it in perspective, 1.7% growth per year compares to an average of the region of South Asia of 4%, or the average of low middle income countries, that is the income group in which Pakistan falls, well, at 3.2%. So low real GDP per capita growth over the past 2 decades. But underlying that, there's a challenge of productivity. The numbers on productivity are even more concerning. If you look over the past 3 decades, how much more value an average Pakistani worker added, right, in the last 30 years, it added 40% more. So value added per worker, that is a measure of labor productivity, increased by 40% in the last 3 decades. Compare that to Vietnam. Average labor productivity in Vietnam increased by 330%, 8 times faster. In Bangladesh, 175%, substantially faster. So the question that we pose in this report is, why is it that growth has been so low, and what can be done to change this? And what we find is that the growth in Pakistan has been stunted by the inability of the country to allocate its resources and its talent to the best productive uses. And the reason behind that, perhaps that phrase sounds sort of like a mouthful, right? But the reason behind that inability has to do with a number of distortions. Distortions that are introduced by policy, or distortions that are unaddressed by policy. And I will mention a few. So to begin with, in Pakistan, tax rates or tax policy is extremely distortive. And what it does is it encourages that investment flows into non-productive sectors rather than into productive sectors. So with property tax rates being extremely low, income from property gains, from real estate gains are very low, whereas profit tax for manufacturing sectors, for modern services sectors, is relatively high. What that does is it incentivizes investors to go into real estate and into land as a store of value, rather than going into dynamic tradable sectors like textiles, but like so many others, dynamic modern services. Now what happens is that if more investment goes into this non-tradable real estate, when the real estate sector does well, there's more income, and that more income creates demand for more imports. But because there is only limited investment that goes into manufacturing and tradable services, what happens is that the income that that investment creates also adds to imports and adds to a limited supply of exports. So on the one hand, you have a very big sector, that real estate, that creates income, that creates demand for imports, and the manufacturing and modern services only can create a limited supply of exports. What this ends up doing is, as the economy grows, what happens is that import demand grows much faster than export supply, and you end up accumulating large trade deficits. Eventually, these trade deficits are so large that nobody's willing to finance them, and that is when you face a balance of payments crisis like the one that you're facing currently. So basically, that distortion that allocates a lot of resources into non-tradables rather than in tradables is at the core of the productivity problem, but it's at the core of that balance of payment, recurrent balance of payment problems that the economy has. And let me mention 2 other distortions that make the problem a little bit more, deeper. The second distortion that we look at in quite some detail is the way trade policies are used in Pakistan. So import substitution is something that everybody talks about in Pakistan, much more than we see in other places. In part it's because there's a foreign exchange constraint. And so the thought is that if we substitute imports, then we'll fix that problem of the foreign exchange constraint. But truth is that what import substitution policies do is they also end up substituting exports instead. So you're basically shooting yourself in the foot when you increase import duties if you want to curb imports. Yes, you may curb imports a little bit, but what you also do is you create extra profits if you focus on the domestic market. And so firms have more incentives to sell domestically because the domestic market is more protected from import competition. So more import duties mean less exports. And this is something that we see also in the data. So a lot of resources into non-tradables. The little resources that go into tradable sectors mostly focus into inward-looking sectors rather than into export-oriented sectors. And then a third element of distortions has to do with the fact, and I don't know if my hosts are going to like this, but have to do with the fact that a lot of the support that government gives to the private sector actually is oriented into textile and apparel. So if you think about EFS and LTFF, the credit subsidies that SBP gives, they are quite biased in favor of textiles and apparel. If you think about DLTL, that of course now there's not much DLTL, but at some point there was a subsidy given by Ministry of Commerce, very tilted in favor of textile and apparel. One can understand that because it's the largest sector in the country, right? But the consequence of that is that the economy will have a challenge to diversify out of the textile and apparel sector because a lot of the support is focusing on that sector. So the last element that I want to mention that we discuss in the report is the allocation of talent. The allocation of talent is another big problem in Pakistan, and we focus on one particular element that is female labor force participation. In Pakistan, if you look at the past decades, women have done really well in increasing their educational attainment, but they haven't done really well in increasing their participation in the labor market. So female labor force participation in Pakistan is among the lowest in the world. And we estimate the cost that that has. So we basically look at what would happen with the size of the pie, so with GDP, if female labor force participation rates in Pakistan were to match those of Bangladesh. So not comparing to Norway, comparing to Bangladesh, a country with similar cultural norms. What we find is that the gains would be between 5 to 23% of GDP. So sizable gains, static gains, depending on how complementary labor market policies are out there. But the crucial element there is you have women extremely talented that are getting more and more education, but they're not putting that education to add more value in the economy. So I'll stop here. This is a summary of what we look at, and I'm happy to expand if needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Patron, up. Mr. Gaur Ijaz, the patron-in-chief of APTMA, please.
बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम। सबसे पहले तो मैं ये कहूँगा कि I'll keep it my language English or shall I keep it Urdu? Okay, I'll keep it in English. First of all, the most important point here is that today we have more imports than exports. This is what is actually creating havoc to our economy. $80 billion of imports and $30 billion of exports. $30 billion for a 230 million people population. Fifth largest population in the world. Everything, whatever we have surplus, that's all what it is. And out of $30 billion exports, $19.33 billion was textiles, which is 66% last year. What is the issue? We have no surplus for exports. We are not competitive. We don't have export culture. We lack the ability to work and produce quality goods which can be marketed in the world. We lack the will to export, or the government does not let us export. I've been thinking about these and continue to ponder what is the real reason. So when I look at all the reasons which I've listed just now are correct. All of them are in place. We are not competitive. We have no surpluses. We are not allowed to export. We continue to play the game of, I used to remember the Ludo game, the snake and the ladder. The moment we try to climb up the ladder, the snake is there, hit us back around level 0. Textiles is the solution to the country. We thought of it, we all worked for last 5 years on it. And what was the basis? I went into the economic charts very deeply and came up with a small figure, $6 billion. And where did I derive this $6 billion from? 2008, Pakistan was fine, rupee was 60, not far away, was 60 rupees to a dollar. 1947 to 2008, 60 rupees to a dollar. So I went down to 2008, 60 rupees to a dollar. What happened? The total debt of Pakistan at that time was $48 billion. I looked at 22 figure, it was $130 billion. I subtracted 48 from 130 and I came up with the number that it's $82 billion. And when I divided $82 billion with 14 years, it came to $6.8, $6.9 billion. So the net effect was this $6.8 billion has been our $6 plus, 6.8 has been our issue, which we have not been able to deal with. Only $6.8 billion annually. We could have decreased our import by increasing our agriculture production. We could have increased our exports by $6.8 billion. We could have created an environment for foreign direct investment for $6.8 billion. Or we could have curtailed our expenses in dollars by 6.8. All options were available. 14 years, 3 IMF programs. And we saw that nothing was done. Nothing was done. Result, Aptima sat down, went to the government and said, this is the issue, $6.8 billion. We can resolve your issue. Make us competitive. They asked us, what do you need for being competitive? We told them, you give us 6% duty drawbacks of exports, drawbacks on local taxes. Stop that 6%. I said, what do you mean? We give you 6% of exports, you're telling us? I said, stop it. You have been giving me this 6% for last 10 years. It has not added $1 to export. So I have to tell you that it is not adding to my competitiveness. The industry is telling you, make us competitive. They said, how do we make you competitive? I said, give us a regional competitive energy tariff. In India, it's 9 cents. In China, it's 9 cents. In Bangladesh, it's 9 cents. In Vietnam, it's 7 cents. Give us an international regional energy tariff. Don't load cross subsidies on exports. You have to give a subsidy to consumers of below 300 units and give it to them. You want to give subsidy to other segments, give it to them. You cannot collect funds. You cannot collect electricity bills. Please don't load the export sector. They agreed with us. They gave us a regional energy tariff of 7.5 cents, which was calculated by PIDE, which was calculated by all international forums, came in force. Result, $5 billion was invested by the textile industry. After 10 years, the growth in exports, what we saw, it took us 2 years to set up that industry. We saw that the export of textiles rose from $12.3 billion to $19.3 billion in 22. $7 billion, exactly $6.8 billion was coming. Now, when I say it is a game of snake and the ladder, it's been withdrawn yet on 1st of March. I'm back to 15 cents. I'm no more viable again. So the snake has stuck again and fallen down on the ladder. Now, result is $5 billion of industry has been set up, new industry, which can give this country, which has given this country $7 billion last year. Now that capacity is closed as of today. My last month's export has fallen down to $1.2 billion a month. My last month has fallen down to which is I'm going back to the 2018 number. And my capacities are closed by 40%. We continue to learn. Now, why is this devaluation which has taken place? Anybody has thought of it? Does it increase the number of dollars? No. But we need to keep our exchange rate in line so that our demand and supply of dollars is balanced. So it has to be an international exchange rate. So exports are competitive. Imports are controlled. We cannot subsidize imports. We cannot make our exports incompetitive. There has to be a balance. But what is it done? From 170 to 270, it doesn't help the exporters. People think that devaluation helps the exporters. Yes, only to the extent of the inventory they are carrying for 3 months. That's it. Otherwise, everything gets adjusted in cost in terms of dollars. Everything got adjusted. It's all energy, I'm saying 9 cents, cotton is at 95 cents. Interest rates, when you devalue the currency, what happens is it brings in imported inflation. When it brings in imported inflation, because everything is imported, the real interest rates have to be higher than the inflation rate. Result, if today the inflation number is 19, they have kept the interest rate at 20. If the number is going to be 22, because the currency devalues, inflation kicks in, interest rate rises. Now where are we going? If we continue this pattern, interest rate is going to be 26%. It doesn't add any value to anybody. Who is the biggest borrower? Government of Pakistan. 35 trillion rupee is the total debt stock as of today in domestic money, 35 trillion. If they are going to pay 20% interest rate on this money is 7 trillion. Can you imagine what is the total FBR collection today? Is 7 trillion only. That's the total tax the government collects. That will only go in interest. Now, they are saying that we are controlling inflation by increasing interest. Yes, it is true in economies where students borrow to pay their education fund, consumers borrow to pay for their mortgages, for their vehicle expense, for their traveling expense. We have no such mortgages available. There is no such credit available. Result, what they are doing to control inflation through this tool which they called is tool used to control inflation is not the tool which is effective in Pakistan. It is effective in those economies where consumer borrows, and when you increase the interest rate, then the consumption goes down, because here it is not too much money chasing that product which is causing inflation. It's not too much money. It is actually the cost going up because of dollar devaluation. The petrol is not going up because your demand is more. Petrol is going up because the currency is devalued, it is imported, it is in terms of dollar. Energy is all on imported fuel, it is going up because of the dollar value, not because you are consuming more. The prices of all commodities in the market are not increasing because you have so much demand and it's causing shortage. That is not the fact in Pakistan. That is the fact in European economies where too much demand can be curtailed through interest rates because they borrow to create that demand. There is no demand because of borrowing. Now, a wrong tool resulting fiscal deficit. There is no money for development. There is no money for infrastructure growth, the total debt cost of 7 trillion, 60% goes to the provinces. So if the collection is 7 trillion, 60% will go to provinces. Federal government will be left with 3 trillion. Imagine a federal government operating with 3 trillion. And the cost is 7 trillion only for financial expenses. This is the federal government status which we are working on. Can the economy work? My point of view here is there has to be homegrown solutions for economy. We need to have our own priorities set for it. We cannot have imported economists coming in and telling us how Pakistan should run. They are very good in their textbook philosophies. We know those textbook philosophies. We are one of the best students of economics here. That's not the case in point. Case in point is what is the ground level reality. If you will not let the regional energy tariff apply and you will tell the export industry has to pay domestic consumers tariff subsidy and has to pay 40 rupees or 16 cents and export to the world market, Target is not interested to buy from you because 35% cost of energy is the cost of production for textiles, 35%. So if you increase that cost to double of the world, how would you compete? You're bound to close down. So the snakes bites, we fall down again. Now, the whole structure is we need to take our country's economy seriously. We need to take our destiny seriously. We are falling not because of something is wrong with us. We are falling because they don't know what they are doing. The policy has to be homegrown. The policy has to be on the basis of what do we have. I was just looking at numbers yesterday. $80 billion import, $30 billion export. They gave me a number that $50 billion can only be added through horizontal and vertical value addition in agriculture. $15 billion through agriculture, productivity increase in cotton and wheat only. And $35 billion can be added in using the lands we have. Imagine an agriculture country, poor people, 90%, who are ready to work. And our lands are lying empty, or we are importing $16 billion of agriculture goods from the world. $16 billion of agriculture goods from the world. An agriculture country, poor people, I am repeating, with land abundantly available. Cotton, we just comparing yesterday, the yield of cotton is 400 kilograms per hectare. We are number 47 in the total chart of the world cotton producers, number 47. Number 47 in yield, 400 kilogram per hectare. Highest is 1800. How will my farmer compete? At 400 kilograms per hectare, if an international farmer is getting 70 or 80 cents, so with 1/4 yield, my farmer can only compete if he gets $3.20. It's a simple maths. What are you giving to your farmer? What was the duty of the state? Just research, enabling environment. There's been no research. Cotton crop in 1992 in Pakistan was 15 million bales. This year is 5 million bales. We've just fallen since 2012 from 12.3, this was the last time I saw in 2012, 12.3, we are down to 5 million bales in 10 years. 12.35 million bales. $4 billion of cotton is required this year, only to produce, imagine, 1 million bale is $400 million. $400 million, $19.3 billion I said was exports, 15 million bales consumption, which means $1.3 billion is the total value of million bales. $400 million, 1.3 billion, and I'm not allowed to import cotton to run my industry. I can't. So my only point, what I'm trying to say is, we need to prioritize our economic policies. We need to prioritize exports. We need to prioritize our people. We need to prioritize our agriculture. We need to prioritize our yields. We need to prioritize ourselves. That's the only way this nation will grow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gohar. Yes, we need homegrown solutions, and you made a very good case for prioritizing our, our production and our allocation of resources. I think Amir wanted to say something on export-led growth. Amir Fayaz, ex-chairman of APTMA.
Actually, I have to leave at 2:30. Hamid, if I could just come in with the description of the electricity and the gas sectors so that
okay.
there is some understanding of what it means to have a competitive tariff. And, when we say tariff is not competitive, how is the tariff actually being
Okay,
set?
please go ahead, Salman.
And then I'll have to leave actually at 2:30. My apologies for that. Okay, I'll just talk about electricity pricing and gas pricing in Pakistan, because these are done not through the free market. These are done through a framework which is heavily determined by the law, including the constitution. So let me start with electricity pricing. Now, electricity obviously has the generation component, the distribution component, in between the transmission component. And then electricity goes to various categories of consumers, the households, the commercial consumers, the industrial consumers, and so on. So how is the electricity tariff determined? Because we hear all the time that the textile sector is seeking subsidies in the supply of electricity, and the government also puts to aside in its accounts a large figure as subsidy on electricity tariffs. So what is the nature and the meaning of this term subsidy when we use it in the context of the electricity tariff? The first thing to note is that there is, as I said, no competitive market. So the tariff is determined through NEPRA, the National Electric Power Regulatory Authority, and ultimately the government has the authority to change the tariffs that are determined by NEPRA and to declare what will actually be recovered from the various categories of consumers. So what we see happening is that there are different kinds of generation capacities installed. There's the hydro capacity, there's the the various kinds of thermal fuel-based capacities. You've got some wind and alternative energy capacity now. So all of that goes into a pool, into a common pool. It passes through the national grid, the NTDC, the transmission and distribution company takes this electricity, passes it through, gives it to the various distribution companies, the Lahore Electric Supply Company, the Multan, Peshawar, Quetta, and so on. Only one of which is in the private sector, the K Electric. All other distribution companies are owned and controlled by the government. So that is the lay of the land. And what happens is that at the distribution end, you have line losses of varying intensity. So for instance, LESCO and FESCO are among the best in terms of low line losses. The line losses are perhaps around 5%, 6%. And the industrial consumers connected to the LESCO, FESCO grid with their own localized distribution networks, in fact, suffer minimal losses. So the electricity being supplied to an industrial unit goes from the grid to the industrial unit with almost no loss. But when you factor in the electricity which is being supplied to households, which is being supplied to shops, there are line losses of varying magnitude. So you have something like 30% nearly line loss when you look at Quetta or Hyderabad or Sakhar, for instance. So these are all distribution companies which are linked as part of a common system. And at the end of the day, all of their costs go into the determination of the electricity tariff that is determined by NEPRA and ultimately by the federal government. Because across the country, each category of consumer is charged the same tariff. So households in Karachi, households in Lahore, households in Peshawar will all be charged the same tariff regardless of the line losses in their particular areas. Similarly, industrial consumers will be charged the same tariff depending on category wherever they are. So what is happening here is that the overall system cost of generation, transmission and distribution of electricity is taken in. That cost obviously has to be met through the tariff which is recovered from the various categories of consumers. And that determination of tariff for the various categories of consumers is then done in a manner so as to enable the recovery of the overall system costs, including the losses. And how the tariff is placed between different categories is a pure administrative expense, decision. So what you charge the households, what you charge the farmers, what you charge industry, local sales industry, export-oriented industry, all of this ultimately is an administrative decision. The system cost of generation and distribution might be, let us say for the sake of argument, let us say 15 rupees. Now if you're charging as your declared announced tariff 41 rupees to industry, then that 41 rupees is simply a figure you've come up with because you wanted to charge households 6 rupees, whereas your cost was maybe 15 rupees across the system. So you are recovering the cost from the industrial sector, because you cannot recover it from the household. So political reasons, you want to keep electricity cheap for the average household. So this is how the electricity tariff is determined. So you come up with the 41 rupee figure for industry or the 45 rupee peak hour tariff for industry. And when different segments of industry go to government to say that, look, this is too high, this is uncompetitive, makes us uncompetitive regionally, the government occasionally relents and it will say, all right, we will not charge you 41, we will charge you 21, or we'll charge you 19. And they describe the difference between 41 and 19 as a subsidy. So you need to understand this is not really a subsidy, this is simply changing the distribution across different segments. Because you had come up with the figure of 41 as arbitrarily as the figure of 6 for the households. So that figure of 41, when the government says is not to be recovered in order to make industry competitive, in order to enable exports, and we will charge 19 rupees 99, which was the tariff till the 1st of March. And that 1999 was being described as a 21 rupee tariff to the export-oriented, 21 rupee subsidy to the export-oriented sector. So we need to consider the use of the word subsidy. Was this really a subsidy? Or were you simply re-rationalizing, as if it were, the burden across various sectors? So the use of the word subsidy is used in common parlance, I think, a little casually, without really understanding that there was no natural market-driven price which you are now not recovering because you have chosen to give a subsidy. The original price of 41 was as administratively determined as the new price of 19 rupees 99, and now we've gone back to 41 or 45. So these are administrative/political decisions which are taken. Otherwise, if you were to say we'll do cost plus pricing, everybody would probably end up paying 16 rupees per unit, because that would cover the cost of generation, transmission and distribution of electricity across the entire country. But we don't charge everybody 16 because we want to charge households 6. And therefore we want to charge industry 41 or 45. And then when we charge them 19, we call it a subsidy. So we need to understand this concept of subsidy in the context of electricity pricing. To my mind, it is used a little too casually. And then it is used as a stick to say that these people who are not competitive in our industrial sector are always seeking subsidies and they can't survive without subsidies. So that sentence, so that blame has to be, I think, put in some kind of context. So that is one thing that I wanted to say about electricity pricing. Now let's move to gas pricing. Now one thing more about electricity pricing. For years there has been a demand that the electricity market be made competitive. Now how can you make the electricity market competitive in the country? You've got these distribution companies and the national grid company with the national grid, the main transmission line. Now if a private sector generator of electricity wanted to enter into a competitive deal for the supply of electricity to an industrial consumer, that generation company necessarily has to use the state-owned national grid. There is only one main transmission line, and then it has to use the distribution systems of the local distribution companies. Now what this requires is the payment of what is called the wheeling charge. And there has been a debate, intense debate over what the wheeling charge should be. the position of the DISCOs, the distribution companies, and NTDC, the transmission company, has been that the wheeling charge should be such that ultimately the cost to the consumer who's buying from this private sector generation company, that cost should be no less than the cost at which, or the price at which, the DISCO is to supply electricity to a consumer within its area of supply. And that kills the whole point in having a private sector generator using the transmission line and the distribution network to compete for the custom of private sector entities that need electricity. So there has been a stalemate on that the last, now what, 8 years. The wheeling regulations were enacted or promulgated in 2015, and we've not had a meaningful wheeling arrangement since then. We do not have a competitive market. NEPRA keeps putting it off. They keep having seminars and they keep issuing papers. But at the end of the day, unless the wheeling charges are made rational so that there actually can be competition in the supply of electricity, you will not have a competitive market. And therefore, prices will continue to be administratively determined. Now I come to gas. Now, the supply of gas in the country and the extraction of gas in the country is ultimately rooted in the Constitution of Pakistan. In the Constitution of Pakistan, since 1973, we have a provision, Article 158, which says that priority will be given in the supply of gas to the province in which a wellhead is situated. So this is not an 18th Amendment thing. This has been there since 1973. And the fact of the matter is that till recently, perhaps even now, Punjab was the only gas deficit province in the country. Sindh, Balochistan, KP all had more gas coming out of the ground than was being used in those provinces. So what these provinces have been saying is that the gas which is coming out of wellheads situated in our territory has to be given to entities that are consuming gas in our provinces, and Punjab can import gas. So whatever gas you're going to import, and we've had imports of what is called RLNG, regasified liquid natural gas, for the last many years now, which costs much more. And that cost has been ring-fenced and has been imposed only, as if it were, on Punjab industry. So this is where a major tension has occurred in the gas tariff, that Punjab industry is told that since Punjab is a gas deficit province, if it is to run its own power plants using gas, it can only use gas which is RLNG and at a tariff which is the RLNG tariff and not the overall gas tariff. So the demand there has been, and it has been, I think, partially accepted by legislation at least, though not given effect in reality, that all gas, domestic as well as imported, should go into a common basket, and there should be a weighted average cost of gas determined, and then that is the cost that should form the basis of the tariff all across the country. There should not be a separate Sindh tariff and a separate Punjab tariff for industry. So this is the lay of the land. This is the regulatory and the legal framework which lies behind this discussion, this debate about energy, electricity and gas tariffs in this country, and how energy supplies or energy provision can be made such that our industry becomes competitive in a regional context. So I hope that is clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Salman. Sorry, we started a little late and we are overrunning time. So I will request the two remaining speakers, Mr. Amir Fayaz and Ali Khizr Sahab, to please make it very short.
So I first wish to thank Mr. Gonzalo Varela for the excellent research that he has done on the Pakistan economy. I'm sure we'll benefit from that. Just to, I won't repeat what my colleague said, but we all understand the textile sector is probably the most important sector of our economy. And Pakistan, as you know, we've gone 23 times to the IMF. Each crisis was triggered by a current account deficit. Our imports, as Gohar just mentioned, are $80 billion without administrative controls. Our exports are $30 billion, sadly only. And then we have remittances of $30 billion. So it's that $20 billion gap that leads us knocking to the doors of IMF, and we are, as we are doing right now. Now, most governments, including the current one, they talk a lot about export and export-led growth, and they give a lot of lip service to this. But when it really comes down to making our exports competitive, it doesn't happen. We have seen in the last few months the manipulation of exchange rate that was taking place. We had artificially created an exchange rate which was discouraging exports and encouraging our imports. We talked about the regionally competitive energy tariff that has been taken away. And as Salman just mentioned, there is really no subsidy in the tariff that is provided to the textile sector. In fact, we are cross-subsidizing other sectors like the domestic sectors, and really the government wants to get votes from their voters, but they want the industry to bear the burden of that. That's the long and short of that. Our working capital is stifled. We have billions of rupees which are stuck up in sales tax, refunds, and as somebody mentioned here, that the government is the biggest borrower of this whole country. Government borrows 85% of the total borrowing which is done by the commercial banks, that's hogged by the government. Now, this year, our textile exports, which had taken up, we had grown from close to 13 billion to more than 19 billion dollars. More than $6.5 billion of exports had increased in the earlier 2 years. Now, sadly, we will see at least a $3 billion dip in that exports in the current financial year. And here we are trying to beg and borrow from IMF, other countries, friendly countries. We are really, our nose is being ground we are grinding our nose into the dirt for what? $1.2 billion from the IMF. Here we are losing $3 billion of exports in this current financial year. So our priorities, have to be export-led growth if we have to come out of the mess that we are in. And really, it's a very simple solution, which I'm going to take maybe 3 to 4 minutes to explain. We talk about the miracle that Bangladesh is. We all remember when Bangladesh was East Pakistan, a lot of people my age remember we said, oh, yaar, chalo jaan chhut gayi Bangladesh se. Look where they are now, look at their per capita income, and look where Pakistan is. The difference is the exports that country is doing. And if you look at Bangladesh, I looked at some statistics, they've got 4,000 garment factories which are exporting to the rest of the world. And can you guess how many export garment companies who are exporting in Pakistan? Less than 200. So you got 200 in Pakistan, you got 4,000 in Bangladesh. That's where we have to invest. In Pakistan, if we were to set up 1,000 garment factories, which APTMA and textile industry has asked the government that we would like to do, create an enabling environment for us. One garment factory, a mid-sized garment factory, can export $20 million worth of clothing every year. If you have 1,000 such factories, that is $20 billion. And that's the gap we are really talking about. It's the $20 billion gap which creates this balance of payment crisis, and we go begging and borrowing from IMF and friendly countries. If we can put in 1,000 garment factories, which will cost, in terms of new machinery and equipment, just $2 billion. The rest is building infrastructure, which is all produced in Pakistan. $2 billion worth of new equipment can produce $20 billion of more exports. And we can get out of this mess. Last that I'd like to just mention is, without an export-led growth, there is just no way out of the predicament that we are in. And you look at, since World War II, you look at the last 70 years, 80 years, countries like Japan, Germany, China, India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, they've all grown on the basis of export-led growth. With export-led growth, we can resolve this problem of current account deficit, and we can create employment. It's a labor-intensive industry, and particularly employment for women. As my friend just mentioned, that can be a real game changer for our economy, because right now, if you look at our involvement of women in our economy, it is minuscule. We need to improve this gender ratio and make women part of the mainstream economy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amir and Mr. Ali Khizr. I request you again to make it short, and I have received a request from the Fala Foundation to ask people to please remain sitting after the session is over. They want to show humanitarian video. It's a humanitarian organization. They want to show a video for a couple of minutes and ask for your assistance. Mr. Ali Khizr, please.
Thank you. So there are no two ways about it that the country needs an export-led growth. But I'd like to change the horizon a bit over here. That's textile exports is not the only export that Pakistan can live on. It's exports. And we need to think bigger than the textile. You talked about the Bangladesh and all that, but in India, it's about $150 billion exports are coming from the IT and services industry and all that. So we need to think beyond on that. And then we need to think what's hindering the other areas export to grow, other manufacturing and services exports to grow, and what hindering people to be more competitive. And before going into that, I like to link it to the very fundamental issue of the economy. That's not the current account deficit, it's the fiscal deficit. So the core of the problem is the fiscal deficit, and that stem out into the current account deficits. That the saving and investment gap between the country has to be filled by the savings of the outside the world, and that feeds to the current account deficits. And that gap is being fed by the fiscal deficits. And when you have a fiscal deficit, the question is why you have a fiscal deficit. We have a fiscal deficit because it's not that our expenditures are high. There are huge inefficiencies on an expenditure, but that's another problem. But the problem is we don't have enough revenues to cover in. We don't tax the real estate, land, we don't tax the agriculture, we don't tax the retail, wholesale trade. And if you see in the past 20, 30 years, many of those investment from the manufacturing sector, be it for the import substitution or be it for the exports, had moved into those areas. We have seen that the concessionary finance doled out to the textile has been used in developing the real estates and all that. We have seen that the textile exporter in the past 15 years have become very big in the retail sectors and all that. And we have seen that the boom which is coming in the past 20 years, where the middle class really jumping up into this is from the retail trade and from this real estate sector. And we have seen that because of that boom coming up in that there's a high consumption and this fueling in the imports. And we have seen that this has reduced your exposure to the manufacturing as an incentive to invest. And again, the taxation become lower and lower and lower. So you need to have the problem and address the problem where it is. You need to tax those sectors where the incentives are misaligned, and then the money to move into the right sectors where the incentives are aligned. And once you tax those sectors, when you tax the income of the traders and retailers and all that, their consumption may reduce by 20 to 30%, and that will help you reduce your current account deficit. And when the returns are compressed, they move into the areas where they're more competitive. So you have to change the whole structure. You cannot have a patchwork that, okay, give you this, not at all. So yes, you have to have a holistic picture. As my friend Gonzalo told that the import substitution has actually substituted the exports. That's perfectly right, because you have taxation which is indirect in nature, even the direct taxation is indirect in nature, then you have a protection on what you produce domestically, and what the inefficiencies in the taxation which are direct, indirect nature are passed on to the prices. And when you're competing in the local market, everyone is passing to the prices, and you are competing, you hinder the competition from outside through import duties and all that. But when you export, you don't have that. You're competing with the world. You cannot recover that cost. And only those who can recover that cost within the exports, who are big boys, who are the Aptama, who are the textile boys. The smaller textile boys, smaller people from many other areas, they simply cannot export because they cannot have the refunds to come in because of those inefficiencies. So Gundalo, I'll take your point one step forward, that import substitution is substituting the exports, and the big boys' exports are substituting the export of the small boys. And that makes them competitive. And then when you have a $1 million, you invest in a plot, you invest in a shop, and then you grow and all that. That's how the structure is being misaligned, as mismanaged. We need to correct that structure. We need to work on that. We need to tax where the tax should be. We need to end those indirect taxes. We need to have a direct taxes. We need to end those refund mechanism and all that, where you need to have a lobbyist to sit in Islamabad to get that. We need to end those structures where the lobbyist has to sit to get the competitive energy rate. We need to have a structure where anyone, any entrepreneur, any SME guy who is innovative, who has idea, who has access to a market anywhere in the world, to come produce and export and get the gains. Unless you do that, you will move in this circle and circle and circle, and will never be able to come out of it. So my message is, think export, think taxation in the right direction, and let the entrepreneur do that. Don't choose winner. Why we choose winner? I mean, we give, but again, because this habit of choosing winner has actually eroded the innovation from the economy. I give you an example. In LTFF, in ERF, these are the concessionary finance that used to be rolled out to the exporting sector, and majority was going to the textile sector. But after the COVID in 2020, as State Bank came up with another scheme, which was TURF, which was concessionary finance scheme for manufacturing, where you were not choosing winner, but 50% plus went to the textile, because there is no other innovation, no other thinking in people to invest anyways. So we need to think the change, the mindset of our entrepreneur as well. We need to change the mindset of the government as well. And we need to change the mindset of the worker to think about the productivity and service exports. That's how we should start with, and let's see how things move up rather than picking winner and going forward. So that's here, stop.
Thank you, Ali Zikr. So I think the consensus of the panel, it seems that we need a real reset of our priorities and our framework, policy framework, and there has to be a huge change in the way we think if we want to move forward towards sustainable growth. We've run over time. We started 15 minutes late and we are more than 15 minutes over time. But if there are some questions, we can just maybe take 2 or 3 questions.
My name is Nawaz, and my question is for the moderator, Hamid Zaman Sahab. When we look back, then the cotton was grown in the subcontinent where the best textile industry was installed in the UK, in the city of Manchester, where UK couldn't produce even one plant of cotton due to its typical cold weather. But once the British rulers had left, we should have been able to earn a lot of money by encouraging and strengthening textile industry. But don't you think that the hurdles on the way in achieving this objective are only 2? The first hurdle is civil and military bureaucracy's colonial way of thinking, and the second, ministers landing from the sky with feudal background and having very little understanding of our domestic economic and social issues. Thank you.
I'd request you to please keep the questions short. We just have time for two more questions.
I'm Ejaz.
I already spoke about that. Weak government always happens when there is interference in the political process, and the government is not allowed to complete its tenure or make its policies on the basis of economics rather than political decisions. So you're right. If I got your question, I couldn't hear very well. There's an echo, but yes, the political process must go on and be strengthened so they can make the correct economic decisions.
And the main reason for this, he mentioned, was the 50% drop in electricity tariffs. But there is one other thing that I think he didn't counter in over here, and that was international buyers choosing to basically diversify their supply chains. They had Bangladesh, they had Vietnam, they had China, but in those 2 years, one of the major factors that led to an increase in exports for the textile sector was that international buyers were trying to diversify their supply chains. So that is one of the things that we should weigh in here as well. Alongside this, I need to mention that I work for a fintech startup, and we are working very closely with various textile mills across Pakistan, and we would love to partner with Aptama and collaborate further on this.
I'll just answer that what you just said. Gohar is not on the stage. You are absolutely right that during that period our exports went up because brands in the US and Europe were looking at Pakistan. We were also lucky that COVID had not hit Pakistan that severely, and most of our industry was still operational during that period when other countries were shutting down. But another aspect to it now is there's a great opportunity for Pakistan is this geopolitical situation that is going on between China and the US and US allies, which means Europe also. They have banned the use of Chinese cotton for their products, for textile and clothing products entering the US, and some European brands are also doing that. That's a huge opportunity for Pakistan. And already countries like Bangladesh, India are capitalizing on that opportunity. There's a shift of exports, which is supply chains, which is taking place away from China, and Pakistan has a huge opportunity to get a bigger market share. But we have to get our house in order. We have to really do the things that are required to make our industry competitive.
I'm Ejaz.
One last question, please. That's it.
I'm Ejaz. I'm mechanical engineer from Nurse University. A very impressive case has been made by Gohar Ejaz for textile. Cost of energy is hitting them very high. 35% is electricity cost, and the tariff has gone up from 7.5 cent to 15 cent. My question is why we are not exploring renewable energy options like solar. From solar, the tariff is less than 5 cent. You can generate 1.5 million electricity units from 1 megawatt. And similarly, there are other options like waste to energy. Municipal solid waste, it is considered as black gold in Scandinavian countries. They import waste, they purchase waste. We are 5th most populous nation in the world, and we are not tapping that waste for energy. We can make electricity, we can make gas out of municipal solid waste, we can make diesel out of this. We are wasting $20 billion annually, but we are not doing these projects. From 70,000 tons per day is our municipal solid waste. So why we are not exploring renewable energy options?
This is all part of the reset and the restructuring we are looking at renewable energy sources. The government needs to do much more to get alternate energy sources, but unfortunately, all their agreements to now have not been in that direction. And solar is not that simple. आपको दिन के वक्त कुछ बिजली मिलती है और रात को then you have to depend on the electrical energy. Right. Absolutely, we need to do much more. And the government needs to do much more on that. I think that was the last question.
So I'm the program director at the Policy Research Market Economy. I find it so unfortunate that you have a leader of a trade association sitting in the center of the hall, speaking to all of these children, and really not doing anything apart from lobbying for the industry. It should be well understood that the entire textile industry is not competitive. Some portions of it are competitive, some portions are not, and APTMA represents those that are not competitive, which is why they ask for the sort of things that they do. We have Mr. Salman Akram Raja, who will speak about everything under the sun, is dealing with all sorts of legal matters, but is not understanding really that these are actual subsidies that we are indulging in. They are actually subsidies. And when you talk about devaluation, as if, for example, APTMA was talking about devaluation, they did not really prove their point by citing any empirical evidence. I find that these kinds of discussions, especially talking about homegrown solutions, these are more political discussions. And we have the agenda of the IMF in front of us. They really don't ask for much apart from putting things back in order as the way they should be. We live in a system which is highly manipulated and it needs to go back to the free market. So that was my 2 cents. I do find it very unfortunate that you have people sitting in an academic discussion and they're really just lobbying for more subsidies. That is not on. Not in these days.
I would just like to clarify that we never asked for a subsidy and we don't like subsidies. And I think after foreign loans, the worst thing that happened to Pakistan industry was any kind of subsidy that was given. This is a very long discussion. There's no time for it right now. We are welcome. Please come to APTMA anytime and we can discuss that. But thank you very much, everybody, for being very patient listeners. And I'm sorry, we've run out of time and we need to end here.
Thank you very
much and thank you for the
Saab.
panelists.